Dr. Elliot Kane had spent years on the Outer Rim colonies, stitching together broken soldiers, stabilizing near-hopeless cases, and trying to forget the horrors he had seen on the battlefield. He never sought glory, never expected recognition. His work was simply a necessity, a duty he had chosen because no one else would. But when the encrypted message arrived, bearing the royal insignia of Tyrannus, he knew his quiet life was about to be disrupted. The message was succinct, but its weight was undeniable. Dr. Kane, the House of Thalor extends its deepest gratitude for your service. You saved the life of my mother, Queen Regent Nivara, and for that, you have the eternal thanks of the Tyrannesian throne. In honor of your heroism, I invite you as my personal guest to the eclipse celebration at the Royal Palace. This is not a request, but a summons of gratitude. King Thalor, sovereign of Tyrannus. Elliot read the message twice, his brow furrowed. He had treated thousands of patients across countless war zones and colonies, but he hadn't known that one of them had been royalty. He remembered the case, though, an older woman, poisoned by an exotic neurotoxin, her condition critical when she had arrived at his field hospital. He had worked through exhaustion to reverse the damage, pushing his medical knowledge and equipment to their limits. He had saved her, but she had left before he could even learn her name. Now, her son, the king of a planet renowned for its wealth, beauty, and power, was summoning him to a celebration in his honor. Elliot exhaled slowly, staring at the royal seal flashing on his datapad. He didn't belong in a palace. He had spent years on dusty colony planets and in sterile operating rooms, not in the grand halls of nobility. But declining an invitation from a king was unwise. More than that, curiosity gnawed at him. What was Tyrannus truly like? And what kind of gratitude did a king bestow upon a mere doctor? With a final glance at the message, Elliot keyed in his reply. I accept. The descent through the atmosphere of Tyrannus was breathtaking. From the cockpit of his small vessel, Elliot saw a planet of unparalleled beauty, vast crystalline oceans, sprawling emerald forests, and towering spires of glass and stone that gleamed in the sunlight. The capital city of Lysara stretched before him like a masterpiece of both nature and civilization, seamlessly blending the organic with the technological. His ship was guided smoothly into a designated landing bay, where an honor guard awaited him, their polished armor reflecting the twin suns overhead. He had expected formality, but the sight of the assembled delegation made him tense instinctively. He was a medic, not a diplomat, and he wasn't accustomed to being greeted like some kind of dignitary. The moment he stepped onto the landing platform, a tall figure in flowing light blue robes approached. She was striking, her silver skin shimmering in the sunlight, her deep violet eyes intelligent and piercing. She inclined her head in a graceful gesture of respect. Dr. Kane, she said, her voice smooth yet authoritative. I am Lady Vasara, steward of the royal household. His Majesty has eagerly awaited your arrival. Elliot shifted his bag over his shoulder, nodding politely. I appreciate the invitation, though I have to admit I didn't expect quite this level of welcome. Vasara smiled slightly, the corners of her lips curving in a way that suggested amusement. You underestimate your importance. You saved the life of the Queen Regent. That is no small thing on Tyrannus. I was just doing my job, Elliot said simply. Vasara studied him for a moment before gesturing for him to follow. Come, the king wishes to meet you before the celebration begins. The walk through the palace was a study in excess and refinement. The walls shimmered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift as they passed, depicting scenes of Tyrannesian history. The corridors were lined with floating lanterns that cast a soft, ambient glow, and the faint scent of exotic flowers lingered in the air. Everything about this place was designed to impress, to remind its visitors that they stood in the heart of power. At last, they reached the throne room. The doors, massive and gilded, swung open silently. The space beyond was equally grand, but Elliot's focus was immediately drawn to the figure seated on the elevated dais at the far end of the hall. King Thalor was imposing, his presence commanding even at a distance. His dark, sapphire-blue skin bore the faint golden markings of the Tyrannesian royal bloodline, and his sharp, angular features were framed by the elaborate ceremonial armor he wore. But it was his eyes, piercing, intelligent, and unwavering, that held Elliot's attention. As Elliot approached, the king rose from his throne, descending the steps with fluid, confident movements. "Dr. Kane," Thaler said, his voice rich and deep. "At last we meet." Elliot inclined his head in respect. "Your Majesty." Thaler studied him, his gaze assessing but not unkind. "My mother told me of the man who saved her life. She described you as relentless, refusing to let her die even when the odds were against her." Elliot shrugged. "I don't make a habit of losing patience." The king's lips twitched as though he were amused. "A commendable trait, and one I do not take lightly." He stepped closer, placing a hand on Elliot's shoulder in a surprisingly personal gesture. "You are an honored guest in my palace, and tonight you shall be celebrated as such." Elliot nodded, though he still felt out of place. "I appreciate the hospitality, Your Majesty." Thaler's expression turned slightly mischievous. "You may find our customs unfamiliar, but I believe you will enjoy yourself nonetheless." Before Elliot could ask what that meant, a low chime echoed through the chamber. Solara stepped forward, her voice carrying an air of formality. "The eclipse celebration is ready to begin." The king smiled, stepping back. "Then let us not keep our guests waiting." As the grand doors to the celebration hall swung open, Elliot felt the weight of 1,000 curious eyes turning toward him. He had been invited to this world as a hero, a guest of honor. But something in the air told him that whatever lay beyond these doors would be far more than he had anticipated. And as he stepped into the grand chamber, he could not shake the feeling that his night had only just begun. The moment Elliot Kane stepped through the towering doors, a wave of heat, sound, and sheer presence washed over him. The eclipse celebration was not merely a party, it was an event woven from decadence and excess, a spectacle designed to ignite every sense. The vast hall was alive with shimmering lights that danced across crystal domes, casting a celestial glow over the guests below. Ornate, golden fixtures floated in the air, shifting their luminosity to match the rhythm of the music, a slow, hypnotic melody that pulsed like a heartbeat. But it wasn't the architecture or the music that stole Elliot's breath. It was the sheer number of eyes that locked onto him the instant he entered the hall. The guests were unlike any he had ever seen. Women of astonishing beauty, each belonging to different species, stood in graceful clusters, their forms draped in fabrics that shimmered like liquid moonlight, shifting in color and texture as they moved. Some had skin that gleamed like polished obsidian. Others bore ethereal markings that pulsed faintly, a bioluminescent signature of their ancestry. There were women with hair like cascading silver, others with serpentine irises that reflected light in unnatural ways. Every single one of them exuded an aura of power, elegance, and something else, something almost predatory. He had expected attention. After all, the king himself had summoned him here, but the intensity of it made his pulse quicken. A ripple of whispers spread through the hall, a mixture of intrigue, delight, and something closer to hunger. Solara, standing beside him, leaned in slightly, her voice low and amused. "I told you healers are revered on Tyrannus, Dr. Kane, but you may find that your reputation has spread." Elliot cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his formal attire, which suddenly felt too tight. "I'm starting to get that impression." King Thaler strode into the room with the ease of a man who knew the world revolved around him. His presence alone commanded the attention of the room, but tonight it was clear that even he was not the center of fascination. That honor to Elliot's growing concern had shifted entirely to him. The king raised a hand signaling for silence, and in an instant the music softened, the air growing thick with anticipation. His voice carried effortlessly, deep and regal. "Honored guests, tonight we celebrate life. We celebrate the eclipse, the turning of the celestial cycle. And above all, we celebrate him, the man who saved my mother, the man who defied death itself." A wave of applause swept through the room, but it wasn't the polite acknowledgement Elliot was used to. It was something else, something charged. Thaler turned to him, his golden gaze gleaming. "Dr. Elliot Kane, you have given the royal house of Tyrannus something priceless. And as such, tonight, Tyrannus offers you something in return, our finest hospitality, our greatest pleasures. Tonight, you are not just a guest, you are the most desired man in this room." A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered women, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something far more dangerous. Elliot felt his stomach tighten. He had walked onto battlefields before, into operating rooms where lives hung by a thread, but never had he felt like prey. And yet, from the glint in their eyes, from the way they watched him with a mix of amusement and hunger, he knew, tonight, that was exactly what he was. Elliot had faced aggressive patients before, soldiers high on combat stimulants, mercenaries unwilling to accept treatment until they were on the brink of death. He had dealt with warlords, smugglers, and desperate refugees, each presenting their own form of chaos. But never in his life had he been surrounded by this kind of danger. They moved in like a tide, elegant and unrelenting. The moment the king stepped aside, the women surged forward, forming a loose but inescapable circle around him. He barely had time to take a step back before a tall woman with skin the color of dark amber and molten gold eyes placed a hand on his arm. "You must be exhausted from your journey," she purred, her voice carrying a slow, deliberate cadence. "Allow me to keep you company, Dr. Kane." Before Elliot could respond, another voice cut in, sharp, teasing. "Come now, Rayla, you cannot be the first to stake your claim." A second woman stepped forward, her presence equally commanding. Her hair shimmered between shades of sapphire and violet, and the delicate scales at her temples gave her an almost serpentine grace. She met Elliot's gaze with a smirk, her fingers trailing briefly over his shoulder before withdrawing. "I think our dear doctor should decide for himself," she continued, turning to face him fully. "Tell me, Dr. Kane, do you have a preference?" Elliot exhaled, realizing that, no matter what answer he gave, he was walking into a minefield. He cast a quick glance at Solara, who remained at a polite distance, watching with thinly veiled amusement. Clearly, she had no intention of rescuing him. Trying to maintain some semblance of control, Elliot lifted his hands in a gesture of good-natured surrender. "Ladies, I assure you, I am honored by the attention, but I came here expecting a celebration, not a negotiation." The statement only seemed to amuse them more. A new voice joined the fray, this one richer, lower, carrying the weight of unshakable confidence. "Then let us not negotiate, Doctor. Let us celebrate." Elliot turned to find another woman stepping forward, and something about her made the others pause. She was different, not just in appearance, though she was undeniably striking. Her dark crimson skin bore intricate silver tattoos that pulsed faintly, as though alive. But it was her presence, her command over the space around her that made the others step back. The king, standing nearby, chuckled. "Ah, and so the queen of the eclipse makes her entrance." Elliot frowned, glancing between them. "I take it she's important?" The woman met his gaze, her silver lips curving into a smile. "I am Solara, first daughter of the eclipse court, and tonight you are mine." A collective murmur swept through the room. Some seemed amused, others less so. Solara extended a hand toward him, palm up, an unmistakable invitation. Elliot hesitated. He had expected formality, perhaps even flirtation. But this was something else entirely. And yet, as he looked into her steady, knowing gaze, he realized he had only two choices: run or play the game. Taking a breath, he reached for her hand. The moment his fingers touched hers, the room erupted into cheers. The hunt had begun. The touch of Solara's hand was electric, not in the literal sense, but in the way it sent an undeniable current through Elliot's entire body. The room responded to the gesture immediately. Cheers, murmurs, even a few less than subtle gasps. Whatever he had just done, it was no small thing. Solara held his gaze, her fingers curling lightly around his as she led him further into the grand hall. The crowd parted for her, as if she carried an invisible force field of command. Around them, the other women watched with a mixture of amusement, intrigue, and, in some cases, disappointment. The competition had barely begun, and yet Solara had already made her claim. Elliot leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. "I take it, I just made a statement." Solara smirked, her silver lips curving into something close to satisfaction. "You did. But don't worry, Doctor. You'll enjoy what comes next." She led him toward a raised platform at the far end of the hall, where plush seating surrounded a central space that appeared to be reserved for something intimate. He had seen these kinds of arrangements before, usually in high-ranking courts where entertainment, dance, and subtle power plays unfolded in equal measure. He wasn't sure where he fit into all of this, but he was certain of one thing. This was not the kind of evening he had been prepared for. Solara settled gracefully onto one of the velvet-lined seats, gesturing for him to sit beside her. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before following suit, aware that every movement he made was under scrutiny. King Thalor, still watching from a distance, raised his glass in a silent toast before returning to his own circle of guests. If the king had any concerns about what was unfolding, he didn't show it. Elliot exhaled, turning his attention back to Solara. "All right, you've made your move. Now tell me what this is." Solara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "This is the part where I decide whether you're worthy of teeping." His brows lifted slightly. "Teeping?" She laughed softly. "You're not from here, doctor. You don't understand our ways. Healers are more than just valued. They are coveted. A man who can mend what is broken, who can bring life from the edge of death, is more precious than gold or status." She traced a single finger along the rim of her glass, her gaze never leaving his. "Tonight, you are the rarest thing in this palace, and I don't intend to let you slip through my fingers." Elliot sat back, letting her words sink in. It wasn't that he hadn't been admired before. Being a doctor meant gratitude, appreciation, and sometimes more than that. But this was different. This was not admiration. This was something far more dangerous. "And if I don't want to be kept?" he asked, his voice calm but measured. Solara chuckled, swirling the liquid in her glass. "Then you fight, and if you win, you leave." She leaned in slightly, her silver tattoos pulsing faintly. "But let me warn you, Elliot Kane, you may find you don't want to leave." The room hummed with the undercurrent of their exchange, the weight of it settling over him like a heavy cloak. She was right. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. The air grew thicker, the unspoken challenge between them stretching like a taut wire. Around them, the celebration continued, but here, within their small circle, the moment had shifted into something else entirely. Elliot had never been a man easily shaken, but Solara had a way of making him feel off balance. She had an intensity about her, a confidence that was neither forced nor performative. She didn't simply play the game. She was the game. A servant approached, bowing before setting down a tray of intricately designed glass tokens. Each one shimmered with an iridescent glow, pulsating softly as if alive. Solara lifted one between her fingers, rolling it across her knuckles. "Do you know what these are?" Elliot shook his head. "Challenge stones," she said simply. "Each one represents a wager, a test of wit, skill, or endurance. Here, at the Eclipse celebration, those who wish to make a claim must prove their worth through these games." Elliot's jaw tightened slightly. "And let me guess, I have no choice in participating." Solara's silver eyes gleamed. "You always have a choice, Doctor, but if you refuse, you forfeit your right to remain." Remain. The word sent an unexpected ripple through him. A few hours ago, he would have jumped at the chance to escape this tangled web of seduction and intrigue. Now he wasn't so sure. Solara selected a token and held it out to him. "A simple challenge to start," she murmured. "A test of reflex." Elliot took the token from her fingers, his pulse steady, his mind shifting into the same mode he used in surgery, precise, calculated, unshaken. "What do I do?" he asked. Solara smiled and lifted her own token. "Catch." Without warning, she tossed it toward him, and the moment it left her hand, it accelerated, faster than any natural object should have. Reflexively, Elliot's hand shot out, fingers closing around the token a split second before it could escape. A faint hum of approval rippled through the gathered onlookers. Solara leaned forward slightly, eyes glinting. "Impressive. Most don't catch it on the first try." Elliot rolled the token in his palm, studying it. "I work with my hands. Reflexes are part of the job." Solara's smile deepened. "Then let's test something else." The next challenge was a battle of wits, a strategic game played on a floating board of shifting constellations. Then came a test of endurance, holding on to a charged sphere of energy that sent intermittent shocks through the body, a traditional trial of resilience. Elliot excelled in both, and with each victory, the atmosphere around him changed. The women who had once merely watched him were now invested. The teasing smiles had turned to something sharper, more interested. Solara, for all her control, had begun watching him with something new in her expression. Approval, maybe even satisfaction. When the final challenge ended and Elliot set down his last token, the room erupted into applause. Solara rose from her seat, stepping close. The rest of the room faded, leaving only her silver eyes locked onto his. "You've won," she murmured. "And now the question remains, will you stay?" Elliot met her gaze, knowing full well that staying meant more than simply remaining in the palace. It meant stepping deeper into something he couldn't yet define. But as he looked at her, at the quiet challenge in her eyes, he knew his answer. For the first time in years, he wanted to stay. The applause had faded, the final challenge settled, but the weight of the moment lingered between them. Elliot stood at the center of a shifting game he hadn't asked to play, surrounded by power and beauty in equal measure. The night had begun as an invitation, an honor bestowed upon him for saving a life. Now, it felt like a test he hadn't realized he was taking. Solara remained close, watching him with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Her silver tattoos pulsed faintly, reacting to the subtle fluctuations of her emotions, betraying the carefully constructed mask she wore. Around them, the other women who had once playfully competed for his attention had quieted, their interest no less intense but their confidence slightly shaken. He had won their challenges, bested them in reflex, wit, and endurance, but now something far more significant loomed. "You haven't answered me," Solara murmured, her voice softer now, though no less commanding. Elliot exhaled, running a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. "You want me to say I'll stay," he said, his voice measured. "But you haven't told me why you want me to." Solara tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Finally, she stepped closer, her presence magnetic. "Because I know what it is to carry a burden alone," she said, her voice lower now, more honest. "I know what it is to be needed, to have people depend on you while never asking what you need in return." Elliot stiffened slightly. He hadn't expected that answer. "You came here as a guest," Solara continued, "but tonight you became something else. Not just admired, coveted. Do you understand what that means?" Elliot swallowed. He understood far more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years dedicating himself to the lives of others, giving everything and asking for nothing. Now, for the first time, he was in a position where people, powerful, extraordinary people, wanted something from him. Or maybe, for the first time, they simply wanted him. "I don't know what I want," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. Solara's expression didn't falter. Instead, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers lightly through his. "Then let me show you." He didn't pull away, and that was how he knew he had already made his choice. The weight of expectation had shifted. No longer was Elliot simply the prize at the center of an unspoken contest. He was a participant, no longer an outsider looking in. The night stretched on, filled with whispered conversations and the low, steady thrum of music that felt almost alive. The grand chamber had transformed, the energy no longer frantic and playful, but something deeper. Solara led him through the palace gardens, where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in slow, hypnotic waves of light, their petals shifting between shades of violet and gold. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of something sweet, something foreign. It should have felt overwhelming, suffocating even. But with each step, Elliot found himself relaxing. "This is what your celebrations are always like?" he asked, watching as distant figures moved through the illuminated pathways, laughter and hushed conversations drifting on the breeze. Solara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Not always, but this night is special. The eclipse is a time of renewal, of change." She turned slightly, her silver eyes gleaming. "For many, it's a time to choose." The word carried weight. She stopped near the edge of a secluded terrace, where the palace overlooked the city below. The lights of Lysara stretched out beneath them, a shimmering ocean of movement and life. For a moment, Elliot simply took it in. He had spent years in medical bays, on battlefield outposts, in sterile environments where survival was the only priority. This was something else entirely. Solara stood beside him, her posture relaxed but expectant. "You think too much," she murmured, amusement in her tone. Elliot huffed a quiet laugh. "I've been told that before." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but charged in a different way. He glanced at her, noting the way her silver tattoos still pulsed faintly, the way the faintest glimmer of curiosity and something else lingered in her eyes. "You didn't fight for me tonight," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Not the way the others did." Solara smirked. Why should I have? I knew how it would end. Elliot arched a brow. That confident? Not confidence, she corrected. Certainty. The word sent a quiet shiver down his spine. He turned fully toward her then, studying her the way she had studied him all night. And now that I've chosen to stay? Solara's expression softened, just slightly. Now? She took a step closer, her voice lower. Now, you decide what comes next. There it was again, that invitation, that challenge. Elliot could have walked away, could have returned to his ship, to the life of solitude he had built for himself. He could have left this world with nothing more than a memory of a strange, extravagant night. But he didn't want to. Instead, he reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. And in that moment, he knew. Tyrannus was no longer just a place he had been invited to. It was a place he might never want to leave. The night had unraveled into something Elliot hadn't anticipated, something that went beyond ceremony and indulgence. What had started as a whirlwind of admiration and unrelenting attention had now settled into something deeper, something weightier. He had thought this would be fleeting, an extravagant display of gratitude, an event that he would leave behind once the suns rose again. But now, standing on the terrace with Solara, the neon glow of Lysara's city lights stretching below them like an ocean of stars, he realized that leaving might not be so simple. Solara's fingers rested lightly in his own, an easy touch, as if she knew he wasn't yet ready for more. She was patient, despite her earlier confidence, despite the way she had claimed him in front of the others. She had given him the space to come to his own conclusion, and that made all the difference. "You're thinking again," she murmured, amusement laced in her voice. Elliot exhaled slowly, glancing at her. "And if I wasn't?" She tilted her head, studying him, her silver tattoos catching the ambient glow of the terrace lights. "Then you would already know what you want. A challenge, not spoken aggressively, not demanding, but one that left no room for avoidance." Elliot turned away slightly, gripping the railing, staring out at the city as if it could give him answers. "It's not that simple, Solara. I have a life to return to, a profession, people who rely on me." She stepped closer, though not enough to crowd him. "And do you love it?" The question struck harder than he expected. Love. He had never allowed himself the luxury of that question. His work had never been about love, it had been about necessity, about survival, about ensuring that the people who crossed his path had a chance to walk away. But love? Passion? A place that felt like home? He had never thought about it, never let himself dwell on the idea that something else might be waiting for him beyond the next patient, the next battlefield, the next crisis. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I don't know what life looks like outside of work." Solara was silent for a moment, and then, softly, she said, "Then maybe it's time you find out." Elliot turned to face her fully now, searching her expression for mockery, for a trap, for anything that would make this feel like the game he had assumed it was. But there was none. Only honesty. She reached up, tracing a single finger lightly along the back of his hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Not because you were chosen tonight, not because the king honored you. Stay because you want to. Stay and see what life could be if you let yourself have it." The words settled in his chest, heavier than he expected. He could leave. He could board his ship at dawn, return to his medical practice, resume the life he had known. He could convince himself that this was nothing more than a moment, a single night in a world of infinite possibilities. Or he could stay. For once, he could choose something for himself. The palace was quieter now, the grand celebrations fading into the early hours of the morning. The eclipse had passed, and yet Elliot still stood on the terrace, still feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. Solara remained beside him, patient, watching him the way one might watch the ocean, knowing it could be calm one moment and unpredictable the next. He inhaled deeply, turning toward her. "If I stay?" "What does that mean?" A soft smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "It means whatever you want it to mean." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "That's not an answer." She lifted a brow. "Because there isn't one, not yet." Elliot studied her, studied the way she held herself, strong, confident, but not demanding. She had fought for his attention, yes, but not in desperation. Not to own him. She had wanted him because he had a choice. Because she knew he had the power to walk away. And yet, she still waited, for him, for his decision. Elliot let out a slow breath. I don't know if I belong here, he admitted. Solara took his hand again, this time with more certainty, lacing their fingers together. Then stay long enough to find out. The simplicity of it was almost disarming. No lifelong contracts, no demands, just an invitation. Elliot looked down at their joined hands, then back at the city, then finally into her silver eyes. For once in his life, he wasn't choosing for someone else. He was choosing for himself. And as he gave her fingers the slightest squeeze, he knew his answer. He was staying.